Greetings everyone, all my beautiful viewership you. Welcome to another game review, this time of Chained Echoes for PC version 1.322. Available now on Steam and other places. So, we'd like your likes, subscribe to your subscriptions. We might comment on your comments. Let's begin. So what is Chained Echoes? Chained Echoes is a JRPG, an Eastern style RPG, heavily inspired by Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, Xenogears, and other RPGs of the late 80s, the 1990s entirely, and early 2000s, mostly made by Squaresoft, now Square Enix or Square Enix. So, if you're looking for references, you can find references in this game, intentional or not, to Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, possibly 11, definitely 12, Xenogears, Mario RPG, Earthbound, and probably more. But for those who aren't interested in the references, who didn't grow up with this stuff, who weren't fascinated with it, what's special about this being just another RPG? Well, Chained Echoes is somewhat like Final Fantasy Tactics in that it has a very political plot with some supernatural elements. It starts off political and becomes more fantastical as the game goes on, and it also involves mechs known as sky armors, and we'll handle that more in a bit. So, in a low spoiler fashion, you have the party. The party starts off very small. We start with two characters, and then a bunch of small sub parties have their own small scenarios. They come together and eventually form one really big party. So you can have four characters from your party active in battle at a time. You can have four alternates, four in reserve. So, for example, this redheaded guy, Glenn. Yeah, he might have someone else as an alternate. Let's just say it's this guy, Kylian, who's also available near the start of the game. So, yeah, you might be like, I don't want you, I want you. And you might be like, well, why not just start the fight with them? And I say, because sometimes you want to set up the fight with a certain party, like a buff heavy party, and then or debuff heavy party, and then swap them to something else. But in practice, you're normally just better off with your best characters and sometimes swapping them for other characters if the plot or the circumstances encourage it. Mind you, this is a 4-act game, and you yeah, near the let's just say between about 5 and 7 hours in after the introductory scenario, which is generally well paced, well balanced, you're able to access the world. You're able to pick your party out of about 6 or 7 members and decide, all right, I want to have this lineup. But you're probably going to settle into your favorite party pretty quickly, even if the game tries to shake things up a bit by introducing new party members and by forcing certain other party members out of the party permanently or short term. So, as a low spoiler thing, all the characters visible on this image are party members sometime throughout the game. Not for the same length, and they don't have the same importance, but they're all playable sometime throughout the game. And this is not the entire party roster. At the end, it's a dozen characters that you can have in your party, and you just have to choose your 4 main and your 4 alternates. And if necessary, the 4 people that you don't care that much about, and you just put them on the bench. So, battles are done in a turn-based fashion. So, for example, if he goes first, he chooses his action, and then that's it. He does his thing, then an ally or an enemy goes, and then it just goes from there, until one side wins, or the plot says the fight is done for whatever reason. Things of note: one, the ultra move bar. So think of it like a limit gauge or a special move bar. This bar builds by just performing actions in combat. So if after enough actions have happened in a fight, then one party member of your choice on their turn can use their turn to activate their super move. The super moves vary in effect, and sometimes it's healing or restoration, sometimes it's damage. I normally went with Glenn because he did double damage to all the enemies and he debuffed their defenses and possibly also offenses. But mostly I used Sienna because she did 5 times normal physical damage. 5 times. And she can be built so that she has a 100% or more critical hit rate. So you do the math. Now, in terms of stat importance, in terms of how combat actually works, there is an overdrive gauge. Now, this overdrive gauge is meant to be like a stress meter where it starts off neutral, and in the gold or the yellow section, after a certain number of moves, depending on your settings, it becomes green, where your abilities cost less mana, or TP or tech points, you deal more damage, and you take less damage. So you deal about 25% more damage and deal about 25% less damage. Overheat is when you've gone past the green and you're in the red, and you just deal normal damage. Things cost, things no longer have their discount, and you take more damage, so about 25% more damage. The overdrive gauge depends. The importance of the overdrive gauge depends greatly on your power level in the game. If you're weak or basically on par with the expected difficulty, then the overdrive gauge matters a lot. At some point, you can be so powerful, and you're basically encouraged to be so powerful that you just ignore the overdrive gauge. It gets in your way. So, how does the overdrive gauge fill? Well, you take actions, or the enemy takes actions. Which means you could have things set up to help you, and then the enemy gets a turn and messes things up because they might summon reinforcements. Or they might put one of your party members to sleep, or otherwise take them out of the fight. Not good. So, while the overdrive gauge does provide some variety in combat, it overall felt like it was interesting for a little while, and on some occasions when I needed it, but most likely it felt like it was in my way. I want to play this game my way. I don't want to basically have to play overdrive gauge roulette. So let me explain overdrive gauge roulette. For most of the fights in the game, overdrive is enabled. There's an indication at the top left of what sorts of abilities, buffs, heals, debuffs, direct damage, utility, whatever, that will lower the overdrive gauge. Sometimes you want to use them. Sometimes you just want to use them to set up for something, someone else who's bigger and better. Sometimes you just want to use that ability, and using that ability will either lower it out of the green or raise it into the red when you don't want this to happen. So, what's meant to be an interesting strategic decision usually gets in my way of, I know how I want to play, stop messing with me. So, that was a significant complaint regarding the Chained Echoes combats, but it was not a deal breaker for me, because the story and the characters were interesting enough that I wanted to just keep going until the end. So, in a low spoiler fashion, you start as Glenn, and you're the boy with the sword. You have a desire to go out, see the world, get rich, become powerful. Typical JRPG stuff. And you're soon joined by your friend Kylian, who kind of looks like James Partnow from Extra Credits. Yes, complete with the color set and goatee. And yeah, the first fight in the game is in a mech. The second fight in the game is in a mech, and then you don't get to be in a mech for most of Act 1. Then, when you actually get mechs, well, we'll handle that in a bit. As for the story, it progresses throughout the island of Volandis. So there's a big world. There's a big world of this game, and this game specifically doesn't cover all of it. It only covers one island because after like 8 years in development, the guy in charge of this, Matthias Linda, just wanted to focus on having an interesting experience for the game world that just seemed most interesting to be in, as opposed to trying to cover the entire world like in a typical Final Fantasy game. When it comes to the story, just assume that everyone's a bastard, and even if you're wrong, you will be right more than you're wrong. So just assume everyone's a bastard. Yeah, it'll make sense if you play the game. So there. Remember, this was the plot seemed heavily inspired in terms of theme and tone from Final Fantasy Tactics, where everyone is a bastard. So there you go. So, in terms of mechanics, there are mechs. How I wanted to like these things. But the game is made in such a way where mechs are where if you're using a mech, most likely you're in a fight that demands that you be in a mech, and at least on hard difficulty, as I played through this game, mechs just felt a lot weaker than fighting enemies on foot when I was meant to be fighting them on foot. Why? Well, characters, not mechs, get a lot more abilities. They can get 48 abilities. Each character, except Kylian, can get 48 abilities total. Kylian can get fewer for plot reasons I don't want to spoil, but most characters that join your party can get 48 total abilities. 16 of these are active abilities, and you can only slot in 8 of them at a time. Well, technically 6 of them at a time, and then plus there are 2 abilities you can get from classes, or basically jobs, throughout the game world. So you can have a total of 8 abilities equipped at a time. Mind you, just like with jobs, I feel like the job or the class system was just meh. There are certain things which are just totally better than others. So, for example, the first job that you can get is the cleric. In a game where healing is rare, at least in the early game, having a class where you can just hit a button and heal everyone, even if it's weaker than using an item, or you can bring them back to life, very handy. And of course, you're going to be using that. So, job emblems are normally just one at a time, unless you master them. So you master an ability, you master a job, then you can pass it along to someone else. Even though the game is intended to be low grind, where you can't grind for levels, you only get abilities through you only get access to new abilities through plot progression, as well as optional quests, optional objectives. You are still encouraged to grind to master all of your abilities as soon as possible. So you aren't grinding for experience points, you're grinding for skill points or ability points, whatever the game calls them. And you are expected, at least on hard, you're expected to grind everyone to max pretty soon after you get them, which kills the pacing of this game. So I don't like that at all. Just like with mechs, I don't like just like with how mechs were implemented. Ick. Something else about mechs. once you get mechs, even though you can play with mechs in Chapter 1, you don't get to do much with them in Chapter 1, Act 1. Act 2, you start with mechs, and then you go from there. Mechs, well, let's just say this: you're expected to grind every character to maximum proficiency as soon as possible with every weapon type, so that you can learn every ability and max your stats, which is handy, and it'll keep you on pace or even ahead of the curve for the first plot fight or first plot area or two where you're required to use mechs. And after that, it's just, I felt like it was downhill from there and poorly balanced. Because because mech combat eventually is, I prevent you from acting, I prevent you from acting, I prevent you from acting. Are you dead yet? Yes or no? And yeah, mechs. Let's just say the immersion of the world is somewhat broken by mechs, because yes, sometimes it makes sense if you're fighting mech on mech, or you're fighting a tank with a mech, or a dragon with a mech. But when you're fighting giant black sheep with mechs and losing, think about this for a moment. You have giant mechs that could demolish buildings, and you're losing to giant sheep. This is humiliating. The militaries of this in-game universe should just have some war sheep and skip the mechs. But anyway, and if you are just fighting something that's like way below your pay grade, that you could be fighting on foot with mechs, you can't steal any items with Sienna or someone else. So mech combat just didn't feel like it was right. And toward the end of the game, when enemies, especially bosses, get act twice or act thrice, meaning they get double or triple turns, it just becomes even more ridiculous. Like how one guy with a trident near the end of the game can be a serious threat for 4 people in mechs. This is the point where I stopped caring about balance. I used Cheat Engine and just gave myself infinite items, and I spammed elixirs to get through this fight, because this was absolutely ridiculous. To me, one guy with a trident, even if he is some sort of hotshot hero, should not be able to take these things on. It is absolutely ridiculous to me. Then again, even the excuse of it being anime or a JRPG was not enough justification for me. It was just ick. Another poor balance point regarding mechs is that upgrades for mechs are rare. Healing items beyond your basic revive mech and basic heal are also rare, and to my present understanding, finite. So, this means mech fights are basically poorly balanced, and you don't get to like raffle stomp things the way that I think that you should, because that's what I was expecting, that's what I was wanting. Anyway, back to the optional stuff. The sideboard, the reward board, is something that you gain access to once you leave the dancing city of Farnsport. With this, the optional objectives are for a variety of zones. Not every zone in the game, just for a variety of them. By completing these objectives, sometimes it's just entering an area, or killing a bunch of a certain enemy type, or killing a mini-boss, or collecting a certain number of collectibles, or opening chests, or finding hidden treasures, or opening caves, or some other objective. Yes, by completing objectives, you get individual rewards, so skill points, money, sometimes an item. And if you get enough of these in a row on a board, you get a some sort of meta reward. So you get you get an item which allows you to activate a job shrine like cleric or warrior or gambler, or you get or the top end reward is a monument. So eventually, starting in Act 2, you get a base. The base doesn't have much practical utility. It's just there in part because Breath of Fire 2 did it, and it was handy, and it's also a callback to the Returner's hideout of Final Fantasy VI. The music is similar as well. So, there. Or at least the music is similar to parts of Narshe from Final Fantasy VI. And yes, I call it Narshe because that's how I learned to pronounce it. So yeah, the base building doesn't have much functional utility. It's mostly you recruit guys for your bases, recruit units for your bases throughout the world. That builds up your rank, and then you're able to get some things extra. Like you could recruit a guy who is able to fish out an extra ultimate weapon upgrade item for you. So, and speaking of which, yes, it isn't like you can get the best equipment just in a treasure chest or from a boss somewhere. No, in this game, the best equipment, at least for your characters on foot, is all rusted. A rusted sword, or rusted rapier, or rusted gun spear, or whatever. And you need to use, and instead of cleaning it up with acid or a towel, no, you need to get special items called Souls of Farnese to fix these things up. And you can only access the Ultimate Blacksmith when you are able to access the final boss of the game. Figure that one out. So yeah, by the time you can get the best equipment for your soldiers and for your mechs, you can't use it very much. And even though there is a new game plus where you can and you're expected to use this stuff, as well as a new higher difficulty called True King, I had already maxed everything on all my characters with lots of grinding before I beat the game once. This is the first game on Steam where I got 100% of the achievements, and I was relieved. It's like, good. Now you might be wondering, how long does doing all this stuff take? And the answer is subjective. So, for me, it took about a month of playing on and off to get through the game, mostly on hard. And yes, I did use cheat engines to reduce the grind, because I didn't want to have to grind out everything. I just set the skill point gain to 999, and at some point, I made sure that I was no longer losing items when I used them, because I was just tired of let's just say, the bad balance of mech fights. So, there. I just found it ironic that the mech fights were generally much more difficult than the on-foot fights. So, there. Do I recommend it? I do. But do expect to think like a JRPG or a tactics RPG player, because even though you're confined to your team on either the left or the right side of the screen during fights, and the enemies on the other side, you are expected to think several moves ahead. You are expected to think heavily about team composition. And agility and critical hit chance are generally the most important and powerful stats in the game. So, to give you an example, this guy, Kylan, and this guy, Rob, can reduce one enemy's agility, which on its own doesn't sound very important until you learn that agility determines how many turns a character can get. So, by slowing the enemy, you just get more turns. By boosting your own team's agility, you can get more turns. Combine the two, and certain challenges become much less challenging and even possible, such as the ultimate super boss. One character who, when I played, uh, he got something like 4 turns, and our party got something like 40. Yes, you can do this. You're expected to do this. So, if this is the sort of thing that appeals to you, okay, sure, go for it. I do recommend you try it, and do recommend that you get beyond the dancing city of Farnsport. If you enjoy the first, well, let's just say 10 to 15 hours, you're likely to enjoy the rest of the game, but do know that playing on hard means that you're dealing with certain wonky mechanics. You're expected to grind a lot more, and mechs, well, let's just say poorly balanced in this game. I do recommend that if you play this game, you do all the optional side content, because it will, basically as soon as practical, because it will boost your characters, give them more options, and make the rest of the game either pleasantly easier or possible, depending on how you play. So, there you go. Thank you, everyone. Good night, God bless, and Merry Christmas.